Hi, everybody. Hope you're having a great Wednesday, as great as can be given the state of the world. We are super, super lucky to have with us today a national leader in the criminal justice and a fight for what some might call criminal justice reform, what some might call a freedom struggle. Some people talk about abolition of incarcerated people. But Zachary Norris has been working on these issues for several decades. We're really lucky to have him. And just to place why we're talking about criminal justice in the context of an elections 2020 class, it should be fairly obvious, but race and criminal justice, partly because of what happened earlier this year with the murder of George Floyd. We're talking about his birthday today. And just frankly, the ongoing struggle around police brutality, white supremacy, and criminal justice have become major issues of the election, as we've been talking about. And so having somebody who has spent his life working on criminal justice issues, we think is very relevant to be thinking about now, exactly 2 weeks before the most important election of our lives. So Zachary Norris is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, which is an organization that has been around for more than 25 years, founded by Van Jones, along with others. But Zach has been the executive director for the last 7 years. Zach is also the author of a really great book everybody should check out called We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities. He's also the co-founder and co-creator of Restore Oakland, which was a more than $20 million community advocacy training center building in Oakland that is allowing people to come together, engage in restorative justice, also transform local economic and justice systems, and make safe and secure futures possible for themselves and their families. Zach also co-founded Justice for Families, which is a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. Prior to creating both Justice for Families and Restore Oakland and leading the Ella Baker Center, he helped to build California's first statewide network for families of incarcerated youth, which led to the effort to close 5 youth prisons in the state, pass legislation to enable families to stay in contact with their loved ones, and defeat Proposition 6 several years ago, which was a really destructive criminal justice ballot measure. More recently, that work that Zach started many years ago resulted this year in maybe the most enormous victories that we've seen so far on criminal justice in the state of California. This year, Governor Newsom has announced that all youth prisons are closing in the state of California. And Zach can tell you how when they started that fight over a decade ago, people thought that was crazy. But Governor Newsom just did announce that huge victory for the Ella Baker Center, and they also led the passage of the really historic Racial Justice Act that was just signed into law, that Zach can tell you is the first of its kind in the country, and that commits the state to reduce racial bias in sentencing. But he can tell you a lot more about that. I just want you to know that they've led some enormous victories even recently, and thus, not surprisingly, Zach has won all kinds of awards. His book, We Keep Us Safe, was praised by Forbes, the San Francisco Chronicle, Boston Globe, and Kirkus Reviews. Zach is a graduate of Harvard University as an undergrad and NYU Law School. He's also a graduate of the Labor Community Strategy Center's National School for Strategic Organizing in LA, and he was a 2011 Soros Justice Fellow. He's a recipient of the American Constitution Society's David Carliner Public Interest Award in 2015, and he's a member of the 2016 class of the Levi Strauss Foundation's Pioneers for Justice. So it's a really busy time, and Zach, thank you so much for spending time with us today, and welcome.
Thank you, Saru, and thank you, Michael. I appreciate the invitation. Saru forgot to mention my greatest honor is being her partner. And so there's a bit of a nepotism happening on this call, but that's okay. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and get right into this presentation. So today we're going to talk a little bit about reimagining what public safety could look like. And we're going to talk about the impact of how we think about safety on our democracy itself. And these are anxious times. These are times when we are, just days away from an incredibly important election, wildfires across the state of California, folks inside their homes due to COVID. And I don't have to explain that to you all, but what I want to offer and start with is just a reminder that we can find safety. And so I would offer and ask that people take a moment to just recall a time when you felt safe. And if you feel so inclined, you can put it in the chat. And if you, like me, are still in your anxiety, you might just want to take a breath or two with me. So I'm going to just take a breath in and take a breath out. Take a breath in and take a breath out. And I can't, my technological skills are limited, so I'm not going to be able to look at the chat and present to you. So I'm going to ask that if you're putting something in the chat, check out what's in the chat. Let's marinate on that. But I want to get right into the presentation, and we will come back to that thought about a time when you felt safe. So this is Ella Baker. We are named after Ella Baker. She was a brilliant Black woman. She was a leader in decades of struggle. She believed in the power of everyday people to make change, and she organized with students and sharecroppers. She held folks accountable. She didn't suffer fools lightly. She believed in gender justice and economic justice and racial justice, and she believed that we could transform this country. And we try to build upon her legacy to follow in her footsteps by advancing what we call a books not bars, jobs not jails, healthcare and housing not handcuffs agenda. The Ella Baker Center was founded in 1996 by Van Jones and Diana Frappier. And one of the first campaigns we worked on was to challenge state violence. The San Francisco Chronicle in April of 1996 said that Aaron Williams died of what they called sudden in custody death syndrome. Now, you might be confused by that term. What could sudden in custody death syndrome mean? You might be confused because there is no such thing. There is no such thing as sudden in custody death syndrome. They didn't mention that Aaron Williams had been hogtied. They didn't mention that they unloaded 3 cans of pepper spray into his face. They didn't mention that he had been kicked repeatedly and left to die in the back of a San Francisco Police Department van. They didn't mention the past record of Officer Mark Andaya, who had been booted out of the Oakland Police Department. They mentioned none of those things in the reportage about the death of Aaron Williams. But the Ella Baker Center did mention those things. We did go to the San Francisco Police Commission time after time, and we grew in our numbers and our strength, and we were able to get Mark Andaya fired from the San Francisco Police Department, which was basically unheard of in that moment in the mid-90s. And it was a huge victory and a harbinger of what was to come in terms of the Ella Baker Center, in terms of pushing for victories that many people didn't believe was possible. But when I was growing up in Oakland, California, I wasn't thinking about racial disparities or state violence. I grew up in what seemed like a place like this. This is Oakland, California, right? This is by the lake. I was born in San Francisco. We moved to Oakland when I was a week old. I like to say it was a week too late because I love Oakland just that much. Saru makes fun of me. I was pretty sheltered, being light-skinned, African-American, going to Catholic school, K through 12. A lot of the disparities and a lot of the inequality, quite frankly, was not lost on me, but didn't impact me in the same way that it impacted some of my own family members. And so at Harvard as an undergrad, each time I came back from school, I would find that, one summer, a friend of my brother's had been shot and killed around the corner from our house. Another summer, one of his friends was homeless. Um, and I also just started to think just how differently young people were treated, often for doing some of the same things. So at Harvard, if you got in trouble with drugs or got into a fight, you were given counseling, you were given a semester off at worst, you were always, it was always clear that you were more than your worst mistake. And I saw family and friends locked up for doing some of the same things. And so that is really what led me to an interest in working at the Ella Baker Center, and started me on my journey of thinking about the history of this country and the history of Oakland. And I was just doing a presentation with the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. So I was talking a little bit about housing. This is a map of Oakland and Berkeley. It shows the redlining that designed and inscribed particular regions of Oakland as being places that were no-go zones in terms of loans, where people couldn't find a loan to improve their homes. And many years later, some 70 years later, you'll find that that same map overlays with the map of where foreclosures happened in the city of Oakland and Berkeley. I almost lost my house myself to the foreclosure crisis. Um, my dad and I bought a house, and we were underwater on our mortgage, and I was ready to give up the house. And my dad said, you know, you fight for other people, you better fight for our house. So I had my marching orders. Saru and I organized, we sent letters. We even did a protest outside of Goldman Sachs, which Goldman Sachs has this like 100-story building in San Francisco, and there were 4 of us doing the protest in this giant plaza in front of this building. Goldman Sachs owned the Litton Loan Servicing, which is the company that was kind of doing us dirty on our loan. So we had our signs, and we were holding them up as high as we could, but they were never as high as that big ass building that we were in front of. And so we went to the front door, and the security guard like put one foot in front of the door and sort of opened it and said, "What would you want? What do you want?" So we handed him our demand letter that said, you know, we want a Obama HAMP modification, et cetera. And I'm sure he said he was going to deliver the letter. I'm sure he delivered it to the trash can. Sarah and I went to lunch thereafter, and we got a call, and the call was from somebody from Litton Loan Servicing saying we would in fact get Obama HAMP modification by that Tuesday. And sure enough, we did. We were able to save our house. What happened was the protest wasn't so super successful, but we had been calling and asking people to call his office, and Matt Nelson at Cause the Who Just Cause managed to get the cell phone of the VP at Litton Loan Servicing. So he was getting all of these calls while we were having this unsuccessful protest. So the moral of the story is direct action gets the goods. We were able to save our home, but unfortunately, other folks in my family lost their home during that same crisis. It became the largest loss of Black wealth in the history of the country, and was one of many indicators for me of like, what the hell is going on in our country? By that time, I was somewhat active, but I started to think about, even before then, like, we proclaim to be a leader in the world, even though we're a small percentage of the population, but what do we actually lead in? We have 4% of the world's population, but we have 25% of the folks who are incarcerated in the world here in this country. We have 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's carbon emissions. And so the way in which we have treated people and the planet as disposable is evident in these statistics. It is evident in new statistics that we now have nearly 25% of the world's COVID deaths. And many people are seeing 2020 as sort of an aberration. And I would submit that 2020 is more of a culmination. It is a culmination of a history of wrong thinking about what democracy is and what actually makes us safe. And so sometimes I have been prone to saying, you know, I think we've forgotten what public safety means. But I think the real truth of the matter is probably that we just have never gotten it right in terms of what public safety means. This quote is from Teddy Roosevelt, who was a president of the United States. And he said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. Now, this was responding to a motto that animated the expansion of the country, that the only good Indians are the dead Indians. And it had an impact not just in the 13 colonies, but all the way to California, across these United States, where the genocide of Native Americans from 1846 to 1873 roughly accounted for a loss of, I believe, about 80% of the indigenous population in California. 80%, y'all. That logic still informs how we think about governance. Grover Norquist founded the Americans for Tax Reform in 1985, and at the urging of President Reagan, he declared, "I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub." Now, this idea of small governance is really, in my mind, a misnomer. I think a more accurate way to describe the last 40 years of American history and our model around governance, a bipartisan model, I would add, is that the only good government is a death government. Now, what do I mean by that? Because that is a stark way of saying things. I mean that all of the things that accelerate the morbidity and mortality of Black and brown people, not just in this country, but around the world, are the things that are funded, at extreme levels. So 53 cents of every federal dollar goes to the military. Millions of incarcerated people, and that number has climbed from 1980 to now, effectively. Funding for police here in California up some 227%. Across California, 294%. Here in Alameda County, 269% in Oakland. So the lion's share of resources go to policing at the municipal level, not just in Oakland, but in cities across the country, right? And as Reverend William Barber says, these are just sort of like the most overt statistics, right? These are the things, the policing in prisons that accelerate the morbidity and mortality of Black and brown people, of poor people as well. But that's not even counting what he calls the death measures on the down low, right? And that refers to a lack of health care. So each time we've seen a recession in this country, policing and prisons have continued to get funded, but health care has been cut. Housing has been cut. Employment has been cut. And so for every, I think he said, I'm going to get the statistics wrong, but that for every so many people who don't have health care, a certain number of people will die. Some 700 people die from poverty. And these are statistics that are a day, as I understand it. And these are statistics that were pre-COVID, right? And so post-COVID, these dynamics have gotten even more stark. And I think they begin to explain a phenomenon that would be inexplicable if we're just thinking through the logic of the criminal court system, because the logic of the criminal court system really focuses our attention on crime in the streets rather than crime in the suites of power. It focuses our attention on crime on the corner rather than crime in the corner offices. And crime is actually at historic lows generally, but our anxieties are at historic highs. And that is because the things that there is a difference between crime and what the criminal court system focuses on and overall harm, which is a much larger circle, right? And there's some Venn diagram among those two circles, but harm is a much larger animal. It encompasses harms associated with climate change and inequality. It encompasses harms associated with the opioid crisis, which was approved by the FDA, right? So the corporate entities have not been held accountable for the harms that they have caused. And there are these architects of anxiety, our president being one of them, who are number 45 being one of them. I'm hesitant to call him our president, right? Number 45 being one of them, who really stoke divisions in our society, who blame the folks on the corner, who enact and put forward what I call the "he keeps us safe" lie. So the book is called We Keep Us Safe, and I believe that's the sort of truth of the situation. But the he keeps us safe lie is the lie that the architects of anxiety tell. The architects of anxiety are using an abusive lie, because what do abusers do? They say to the person that they are abusing, don't trust the people closest to you. Don't trust your girlfriend. Don't trust your neighbor. Don't trust your mother. Only trust me, even as those abusive people are causing the harm inside the home. And inside the home that is this country, the president is doing the same thing. He is saying, don't trust your neighbor around the block. Don't trust your neighbor at the border. Don't trust your neighbor in distant lands. Only trust me. Meanwhile, he is hiding the harms that are ever present from ongoing state violence. He is bringing those harms. He is hiding the harms associated with climate change and inequality. And so we reject those lies, right? And I would ask that we, again, just take a breath, because that's heavy. And if you want to, you can just say, no more of the lies, and just let it out. No more of the lies. No more of the lies. And no more of the lies. I'm going to take a breath. Because fear is a liar. And that reality is not the truth. The truth of the matter is that we know what keeps us safe. And so if we go back to that chat, if we think about that time that we felt safe, I would venture to guess that many people put something in the chat about a time when they were in relationship with folks they cared about. I have heard folks describe, being in a faith community or being with family, be it biological or chosen, being in a study group where folks were challenging patriarchy and challenging racism and really finding agency to push forward a different vision of what's possible. Being in relationship is really fundamentally tied to what actual safety is. But if I ask you to think of the term public safety, you might think of a courtroom, you might think of prison bars, you might think of handcuffs. Our notions of public policy and public safety are fundamentally distanced from our notions of our felt understandings of what safety is. And so our criminal court system is really divided and designed in an adversarial way. And so the person who's caused harm on the left, the person who's been harmed on the right, are separated. The state represents one of those people, supposedly. But neither folks have good outcomes with this process. People who go through the criminal court system more often than not recidivate. Victims report very low satisfaction rates with the criminal court system. And the community is really largely outside of the circle of concern. So when the family members of victims say, hey, we want a different process in this case, prosecutors, by and large, never listen to them. They completely ignore them. And so I want to submit that punishment doesn't equal accountability, that punishment is about harming someone who has caused harm. Accountability is about acknowledgement and real consequences. And in order to actually hold someone accountable, you actually have to be in relationship with that person, right? Because you have to know that they understand the harm that they have caused, and you have to be able to see that they have made amends for those harms. So that requires being in dialogue with someone. And one of the ways to do that is to use restorative and transformative justice. Restorative justice really flips the script on that traditional dynamic. It learns from the wisdom of indigenous people, not just in the US, but around the globe, how people have come to resolve conflict. And it puts the people who have caused harm, the person who's been harmed, at the center of the circle. And those who support them are surrounding them. And basically, the person who's caused harm in an individual context is asked to think through and develop collectively with the group an accountability plan to make amends for the harm that they have caused. And The great thing about this is that it is a true win-win-win. You know, a lot of times people say win-win and it's really disguising a win-lose. But this for me is a real win-win-win. And what do I mean by the triple win? So one, the person who's caused harm, less likely to recidivate having gone through a restorative justice process. Two, victims report much higher satisfaction rates with restorative justice because they can see the accountability that has occurred. They can feel it. And three, it's a win for the community because everybody is a part of it. And fundamentally, restorative justice isn't just about an individual process, it can be about a community and collective process. Because what we are seeing right now is that it isn't primarily the folks on the corners or the folks on the streets, but it is the folks in the corner offices and the suites of power who most need to be held accountable. And by developing these processes where we are coming together to think about how do we solve thorny situations, how do we really hold people accountable, we're developing that muscle to effectively hold people in power accountable as well. And so that for me is a real win-win-win. And restorative justice is something that we are embodying in this new space that Saru mentioned called Restore Oakland, which she can take a ton of credit for because we fundraise together, we work together. It's a joint initiative, the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, the Ella Baker Center, Cause a Who's to Just Cause, and Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, Community Works. Deanna Van Buren is an architect who designed this amazing room that you're looking at. This is the restorative justice space at Restore Oakland. And what we're trying to do is paint a different picture, right? Because when people think of public safety, too often they're thinking of punishment and prisons and policing. And we want people to think of restorative justice rooms. We want people to think of economic opportunity. We want people to understand that restorative justice is part of the key path to actually addressing harm, to moving away from punishment and moving towards real accountability. And as I've said, it works not just on the level of individuals, but really on the level of inside of workplaces, inside of homes, at the level of nations through truth and reconciliation processes. So that is what we have tried to bring together in this new building called Restore Oakland. It's an 18,000 square foot building. It houses a dedicated space, which you just saw, for restorative justice, economic opportunity in the form of a restaurant and worker training programs. And then the most important thing, it houses some damn good organizing so that we can hold elected officials accountable to this vision of books not bars, jobs not jails, healthcare and housing, not handcuffs. And it is open. It opened in 2019. We've been doing some amazing work, even in the context of COVID. And it's indicative of how we can actually address harm. But I want to tell you a story, because I think I have enough time, about Richmond, California. Richmond, California, at the turn of the century, had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country. And this story for me is about how we prevent harm in the first place. The city council was up in arms. They had a big meeting in 2005. They brought the police, they brought everybody, and they were like, you know, how are we going to turn the corner on this? People are afraid to go outside. This is not acceptable. Devon Bogan came as a former director of the Mentoring Center in Oakland, and he said, I want to do a mentoring program for the young men who are believed to be responsible for 70% of the homicides in the city of Richmond. And most people were skeptical, but because the city had basically tried all of the punitive measures, they had tried to lock up as many people as they could, they had threatened people with criminal sanctions, it really wasn't moving the needle. And so they decided to invest in this program. The thing that the media picked up about the program almost immediately was that there was a monthly stipend for these young men. And the media picked up the story and said, wait a minute, Devon Bogan, let me get this right. You are paying people not to shoot each other, right? That was the sort of line of the media. Like, how is it in, you know, in this meritocracy that is supposed to be the United States. Wait, you're paying people to not shoot each other. But despite the media pushback, the results were resoundingly positive. It did include a monthly stipend, but it also included travel opportunities for these young men. It also included mentorship opportunities for these young men with formerly incarcerated folks who could relate to them and were providing the kind of guidance that was actually relevant to their experience. And the most important thing that was the biggest sort of flip of the script in terms of this program was that when Devone first started it, he said to these young men, everybody in the city is seeing you as a problem. I want to ask you what you think is the solution, and I want to provide these kinds of supports to help us get there. And through that shift and through actually engaging people and actually moving folks from feeling isolated to feeling as part of the solution, it was not just true that the walls between these young men came down, but really the walls across the city of Richmond came down, and violence dropped precipitously. An 80%, I think it was, reduction over some 8 years. Mothers and grandmothers able to take their kids and grandkids to the park. Shopkeepers able to keep their stores open. And so it was a huge difference for the city, not just for these young men, but really for the life of the city as a whole. And I want to offer that it really is reflective of the way we need to think differently about public safety as a whole. And offer that this is our moment of opportunity. And you might be like, who are all these white folks? These are folks celebrating the end of World War II. And on the right, you'll see Eleanor and FDR. And I'm thinking about the end of war, partly because I'm thinking about the beginning of war. I'm thinking about the threat of civil war that we, I believe, are faced with in this moment. I'm thinking about, you know, the number of lives lost due to COVID, over 200,000. We haven't seen this level of loss of life, I don't believe, in this country since the Civil War, where some 750,000 people died over a 4-year period. And so as we think about what's going to be necessary, I think we are going to need to be courageous. We are going to need to really think about how do we not just get past this moment of creeping fascism in the country, which is something that they were faced with at the end of World War II, but also how do we stay beyond it and never move back to this moment in the country's history. And what I want to offer is that these two folks had an idea about that social movements within the Great Depression were pushing them to think about. And so FDR was actually thinking about a second Bill of Rights, and Eleanor Roosevelt was pushing a second Bill of Rights that would include a right to work. It would include a right to housing. It would include a right to healthcare. It would include a right to education, right? And so when we talk about books not bars and jobs not jails, healthcare and housing not handcuffs, that is really resonant with this idea of a second Bill of Rights, really resonant with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt was so instrumental in moving forward. But I want to recognize that, you know, a lot of those visions of human rights and the second Bill of Rights feel far away in this moment. They don't necessarily feel close to where we are. And I think it's okay to grapple with that reality. But I don't think it's okay to dwell in it, because I believe we have a responsibility to our ancestors. And I often take breaths during the middle of the day. Sometimes I take 2-minute naps. And during those naps and during those breaths, I think about my ancestors behind me. And I think about beautiful people like you to the side of me. And I think about a vision of a different world in front of me. And I think about what courage really means. And I would offer that courage isn't so much about, um, you know, doing the thing the first or being the first. It's about surrounding yourself with the right people and finding courage through common action. And I want to tell a story about that, and I'll end with this story. When I first uh, started work at the Baker Center, um, I was that kid who had went to Harvard. I was that kid who, did really well in school. I was fundamentally a people pleaser, right? Um, I got all of the awards in 8th grade, right? You can imagine me, a little light-skinned kid with a big high top fade. That was more of a curly high top fade because I'm light-skinned and my hair is kind of curly. And I was in 8th grade really just trying not to be noticed as they called award after award after award. And I seemed to get all of them and kept going and sitting down and tried not to be noticed. I didn't notice then the disparities that were prevalent even in that awards. They talk about Oscar so white. It was like 8th grade graduation so white, so Zach, right? I got all of the awards. I was the lightest skinned kid in my predominantly African American Catholic school. And so these disparities, as I have mentioned, I started to think about differently as I got to Harvard. And that's kind of what led me to work at the Baker Center. But I was still that same little 8th grade kid when I found myself as a law school student intern. And I started to surround myself with people who were doing different things. They were saying, we need to stop this super jail for youth from being built. And this was around the turn of the century. And the super predator mythology, the welfare queen mythology was very present in the mind of legislators. They were doling out money to expand juvenile halls in Alameda County in 2000, wanted to build what would have been the largest per capita juvenile hall in the country. And so again, the Baker Center said, no, we're not going to let this move forward. And so we waged a campaign where we would go to the Board of Supervisors. We would, do poetry slams right in the middle of their meetings. We would, take up all the public comment time. And I even did my first poem at a Board of Supervisor meeting. It was my first poem and it was my last poem because it was really awful. But the best thing about bad poetry is that it's still good protest, right? Because you're still taking your 2 minutes, and even if they're trying to close their ears, you took your 2 minutes, right? So we were doing all we could, but the end of the summer was coming, and we knew that they were going to vote for this massive expansion of the juvenile hall in Alameda County, despite all of our creativity and our protests. And so we were at a staff meeting at the Baker Center, and there were just about 8 of us. And the question on the table was, who is willing to get arrested in order to stop this super jail for youth from moving forward? And I, started to see other people like raising their hands. Some people were raising their hands like really high in the air, like I'm ready to do this, whatever it takes. And, despite myself, almost like my hand started to go up a little bit as well. And I'm like looking at my hand like, but it was too late, right? So I had volunteered myself to be a part of this civil disobedience. And the supervisor meeting came on a Tuesday. We had done all of our speeches. Van Jones was doing his Van Jones thing. We were all lined up, the folks who were supposed to get arrested, next to this banister. And the banister really divided the whole room, right? The supervisors sit up on high in their cushy chairs. It's like they have all the power. Then there's this wooden gate, and then everybody else is sort of in the cheap seats. And so we were going to cross this banister to say, no, the people have the power. We cannot let this stand. We are not going to let you basically prescribe the future incarceration of Black and brown youth in Alameda County. And so the signal was supposed to be this, right? So we're lined up. I'm kneeled down next to this banister. And when Van put up 2 fingers, then that means I was supposed to cross through the banister and go and sit down. And somehow I had managed to kneel right next to the banister. So logically, I was supposed to be the first person to go through this banister. Now, I could see Van talking, but I couldn't hear him because my heart was beating like 10,000 miles a minute, right? Um, and so his mouth's moving, but no words. But then I see that signal. And my knees were locked into the ground. And it was like I was supposed to be doing a sit-in, right, on the other side of the banister, but I was like I was doing a sit-in against the sit-in. And so my knees just stayed permanently locked. And thankfully, you know, Harmony Goldberg went right by me. And then another person did, and it snapped me out of it. And we all went and we sat down, we chanted. And they ended up arresting us. They took us to Santa Rita jail, which was a turning point in my life. You know, I suspected in my naivete that, you know, we had protested, we had sat down, we had exercised, you know, our rights in the tradition of the civil rights movement. I expected that they would see the light, they would change their vote, and by the time we got out of jail the next morning, it would all be done. That is not what happened in the civil rights movement. It is not what happened in this campaign. But what we decided, a fellow intern and I, is to take a semester off, despite the fact that the Board of Supervisors had went into closed session and moved forward with the vote for the super jail anyways. We didn't give up. We kept putting pressure on one particular supervisor who was up for re-election that fall, and we got her to change her vote. She was a swing vote. We were able to drastically reduce the size of the expansion. We were able to get them to move it to San Leandro rather than Dublin. And so we had this really tremendous success for its time. We went on from there to challenge the state-run youth prisons, as Saru talked about. We closed 5 of 8 youth prisons, and the governor just recently signed a bill to close the remaining 3 state-run youth prisons across California. A lot of folks contributed to that victory, and it is a huge victory, but it would have never happened if, you know, folks hadn't said, damn the odds, forget what we see, forget, you know, what seems to be the present reality, right? Because when we were, you know, thinking of ourselves as a beacon of light, but we were holding that little match, and it felt like a tidal wave was coming at us, right? But it turned out that when we stopped that super jail for youth, it was heard as far as Louisiana and Baltimore and places across the country. There started to be this movement to end youth incarceration. And now there is this movement to end incarceration, period. And so I would submit to you that, as Ella Baker said, give light and people will find the way. I would submit to you that we have a duty and a responsibility to not be people pleasers, but really to build people power. So let's not be the people pleasers that plays it. Let me try that one more time, because this is how I want to bring it home for y'all. Let's not be the people pleasers that play it safe. Let's be the powerful we that keeps us safe. Thank you.
I'm going to start by asking you to talk about a few key things, and then we can open it up.
Sure.
But obviously this year, there's been a lot of policy moving. The Racial Justice Act was just passed in California, which I'd love you to talk a little bit more about what just passed.
Yeah.
And then at the federal level, you know, President Trump has been taking a lot of credit for this First Step Act that Van was a part of. Can you tell us about that? And on the other side, the Democrats are also talking about a criminal justice reform bill in Congress. Can you talk to us about that? Just because we're talking about the elections, it'd be good to know what's happening at the state level with the Racial Justice Act and any other criminal justice policy reform. And then what is this criminal justice reform President Trump keeps taking credit for? And on the other side, what are people calling for after the murder of George Floyd?
Yeah. The Racial Justice Act gives folks an opportunity to challenge bias in their sentencing. And, you know, you can challenge bias in terms of the provision of housing. You can challenge bias in terms of employment. There is no real right to challenge bias in sentencing, which has an impact obviously in terms of housing and employment and a whole host of other issues. And so it actually is not uh, true that it's the first time that it's happened. There's been something similar in North Carolina that was actually effectively repealed. Um, but we are really proud of this accomplishment, and we are going to work to make it not just prospective, but also retroactive. So that's the next step. We got the governor to sign it. The bill doesn't include folks who have been sentenced in the past, but we want to try to build on that victory. And speaking of building on, victories, I think Van and the folks at Reform Alliance and Cup 50 really regarded the First Step Act as that, as a first step to bring some people home from prison at the federal level, as a bill to provide some level of dignity to women who are incarcerated. It provides for the mandatory provision of sanitary supplies for women, and tampons and really basic issues of human dignity. And the bill has gotten pushback because it also includes provisions around supervision. And I think from an abolitionist perspective, doesn't jive with theories of abolition, which is around not increasing and not sort of pushing the balloon down in one area to see it pop up in another. And many people are very much concerned, and I think rightly so, about growing surveillance in different forms. So you might not find yourself in a prison cell, but if you are on ongoing ankle bracelet monitoring, et cetera, then that's not freedom either. And so, this is something that I think all movements struggle with, is how do we advance meaningful change in people's lives while keeping a vision of what's possible and what freedom ultimately means in our sights, and a path that actually leads us towards that, rather than a path that directs us to false solutions. And I think the Breathe Act is a bill that I think does a really good job of helping to bridge the two, in terms of talking about reparations, in terms of talking about, in my mind, really shifting away from a framework of fear towards a culture of care. So it talks about, leveraging policies contained within the Green New Deal, or sort of environmental policies, to bring resources back to communities. So moving from deprivation to resources, as I talked about. It gives real benchmarks to move away from this bipartisan infrastructure that has been built up over the past 40 years, because the crime bill was really Joe Biden's work, right? The '94 crime bill. And even the things that I think we would regard as, on their face good things, have turned out to not really meet the aims that they were proclaimed to move forward. So the Violence Against Women Act, I think, is one of those examples where it's about $270 million that go towards criminal court interventions, and only $30 million that go towards housing within the Violence Against Women Act. And so housing is really one of the, if not the critical factor for helping folks move away from what many women and gender nonconforming folks are facing, especially in COVID, is violence and an inability to escape, right? And so the criminal court system has, more often than not, really cycled people into poverty, violence, and incarceration, rather than providing avenues for real transformation of those situations. And I think the Breathe Act begins to look at, how do we divest from this framework of fear? How do we divest from punishment, prisons, policing first, vision of safety, towards actual investment in communities? And I'll end by saying, to me, it's not rocket science. I look at one of the safest communities within Oakland, it's actually Piedmont. It's a separate city. They created their own city. They're not safe because they have like a ton of police or the best police force. They're safe because young people believe they have a future of themselves in front of themselves. They go to good public schools. Their parents have good jobs. So those things that make community safe, it's not rocket science. It's just really um, shifting a culture that has um, not seen all of us as part of the public, right? So if we're going to take care of public safety, we have to take care of the public, and that means all of the public. That means all of us.
So speaking of Joe Biden, Amy Allison came to speak earlier in the class, and students had a lot of questions about Kamala Harris and how we can really think about supporting her given her track record as a prosecutor. And Zach, I know you've had many decades of experience with Kamala Harris as a prosecutor and an attorney general in California. I know that there have been a lot of challenges in the past, and now she's the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic side, you know, and in many ways the kind of face and spokesperson for a women of color leader, maybe the first woman of color vice president in the history of our country. So how do you think about that? Because I would think more than anybody else in this room, in this Zoom call, you have experience, like live experience, many decades of working on criminal justice issues with Kamala Harris as the prosecutor, as the attorney general. And now, you know, how are you thinking about, supporting her? Like, can you tell us a little bit about that history and then how you're thinking about her in this moment?
Yeah. Kamala Harris is now fashioning herself as a kind of progressive prosecutor. Just really isn't true, unfortunately. There are, progressive prosecutors now. Chesa Boudin, the DA out of Philadelphia, whose name I'm now forgetting, Krasner.
Larry Krasner.
Yeah. There are folks who are legit, really trying to use that office to challenge a history of criminalization and a move in a different direction. That being said, I think she's been moved. And in my mind, with national elections in particular, we're not really fighting for a candidate. We're fighting for better terrain to be fighting on. And the terrain of Donald Trump's, and this is very just me speaking, right? And so I don't know if there is a YouTube thing, but this is definitely just me speaking personally. But the terrain of a fascist president who is, we all know who Donald Trump is. That terrain is not good. It means a lot of harmful impacts. And yet we know that the architects of the crime bill were Joe Biden, were prosecutors across the country. And so we are clear that we are going to need to continue to pressure and to push these folks, not just on issues of criminal justice, but you all saw the election. It's like Kamala Harris was against fracking, but Joe Biden's for it. And so she's towing the party line and saying, fracking's all good on the debate stage. And so I think we just have to continue to push, to understand that we are fighting for better terrain. We are fighting for democracy itself, or the semblance of bourgeois democracy itself, with this election. And then we have to keep pushing. And we have to push in the first 100 days. Folks like the Working Families Party, among others, are already starting to signal what are the things we need to push for in the first 100 days. And to me, it's not just to move towards more progress, it's actually to save democracy itself. And so pushing for, a different constellation on the Supreme Court, pushing for immediate change that can reverse levels of inequality that haven't been seen in a century, are absolutely critical to our success, because the right wing thrives on isolation and inequality and the things that have grown so much in the last 40 years as we've continued to lock up more and more people.
I think people would love a little bit more if you don't mind, just a little bit more sharing about what it was that she did as prosecutor that made her less progressive than others.
She did what prosecutors do. She blamed the victim. She was, talking about bills and initiatives to um, bring parents to court when their kids didn't show up for school, right? This whole zero tolerance framework and dynamic. She, was a prosecutor that did what prosecutors do. I mean, I don't know exactly how else to say it. Like, I don't know that she was like worse than other prosecutors, but she wasn't going against the grain. And I think that there are now more recently, after there's been this kind of bipartisan push for criminal justice, I don't use the term criminal justice, for changes in our criminal court system. Then it's become more popular. Then you had everybody from Newt Gingrich to Michelle Alexander from different polls all saying, hey, we need to end mass incarceration. And as that change started to happen, you saw people kind of revising, especially people who have been heavily involved in the system, kind of revising their stances, but also revising their records to a certain extent. And I think that she's a candidate that can be pushed in a lot of ways. She and Biden are certainly better candidates to contend with than the current folks. But I think we should be eyes wide open about what we're facing and understand that the architecture that I described, that framework of fear, this massive prison building boom, has been incredibly bipartisan, right? Has been absolutely a bipartisan affair. So if you expect to go to the polling booth and then, just breathe a sigh of relief and be like, oh, good, we did that. I'm sorry, that's not what's going to happen. Not only because Donald Trump is, threatening to steal the election, but quite frankly, even if we get a new administration in, they're going to be committed to the same policies that have led to historic levels of inequality, the largest prison building boom in human history. And so we are going to have to push them hella hard, and we are going to have to understand who they are. We're going to have to build independent political formations that can fight either within the Democratic Party and also outside of it. I think the Working Families Party, other formations are starting to kind of develop their muscle. And that's going to be absolutely critical because these neoliberals do not like us and don't care about us and do a better job of faking it. But to me, it's just that. And so that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I do see several questions. I'm just going to ask one more and then open it up. And I see one that's related to the question I was about to ask, but I'm going to ask this first because it has to do with the election in 2 weeks in a very key state, which is Florida. And then we'll go to Kate's question, other questions that are related. So first, I do want to ask you about Florida. Obviously, there was a ballot measure 2 years ago that was supposed to give felons the right to vote in the state of Florida, which would have changed
formerly incarcerated folks.
Formerly incarcerated folks.
Nope.
But then the legislature turned it around. Can you talk to us about what's happening in Florida since it's a key state for 2 weeks from now?
Yes, so they brought an initiative, much like we have in California. The overwhelming majority of Floridians actually voted to restore voting rights for formerly incarcerated folks. Hugely significant, especially for the state of Florida. Undoing, we talk about the history of this country. I didn't talk about the Black codes. I didn't talk about Reconstruction. I didn't talk about the ways in which our democracy has always been shaped by exclusion, has always been shaped by seeing people of color, Black and Indigenous people in particular, as less than, and denying their franchise and their political power. And so these voting rights laws go all the way back to that period, right? If I had more time, I'll talk more about that. But Desmond Meade and others were able to move this initiative, and then they then passed a law that said if you hadn't paid off all of your criminal court debt, that you wouldn't be able to vote. So effectively instating a new poll tax and that is the law currently. There have been some movements to try to pay for folks' criminal court debt to help people be able to vote in this election. Unfortunately, is not commensurate to the 1.4 million people who are impacted by the passage of the law. So, it's going to have an impact. Hopefully, we'll still be able to overcome that form of voter suppression among other forms of voter suppression that we're seeing across the country. And that does tie to somebody's question around Prop 17. So should I just take that one real quick?
Sure.
So Prop 17, I haven't actually looked at as closely as I would like. So it restores voting rights for people on parole. And I voted for it because people on parole should be able to vote. I think people who are incarcerated should be able to vote. In I think Maine and maybe Vermont, two of those very pretty homogenous states, you can vote while you're incarcerated. So it's really not a matter of it's a matter of seeing people's humanity and their dignity and understanding that even folks who make mistakes deserve a say-so in their future. And some controversy around all of these bills is who gets left out, right? And there are bills that say people who were convicted of nonviolent offenses should be able to vote, but those who are convicted of more serious offenses should not. I don't believe in that. We push hard, in the words of Dorsey Nunn and the folks at All of Us Are None, to try to maintain the integrity of including everybody, because we believe that everyone is more than their worst mistake. That being said, it's the political process, and there are sometimes actors that are more powerful than us that will determine, no, this is my bill, I'm the author of it, and this is how it's going to play out. And so sometimes we then remove our support for the bill, or sometimes we stay on. It's a hard calculus, but ultimately we try to think about, are we expanding the scope of who's seen as part of the human, within the circle of human concern, as John Powell and others say. And if we're doing that, then we think we're doing the right thing, and we may have to work to fight the next battle the next year. So that may be some of the controversy associated with Prop 17 in terms of who gets left out and who's included.
Awesome. Professor Cohen, do you want me to go through the questions in the chat, or would you like to?
One of the questions that has come up, I mean, you mentioned directly the need, in the first 100 days to save democracy itself. And a lot of the sort of options or ideas, but what does that look like to you? What would it mean to enact, to pass through Congress and have signed by a president laws and ideas that would save democracy itself? I think that, we read Astra Taylor's book, Democracy May Not Exist, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone, for this week, I think is an outstanding work of scholarship and of radical political thought. And she has her own particular ideas, but I'm just wondering what you think some specific examples would be. And the students in particular are asking about questions about third parties and how they might be included. But just your ideas on what it would mean to actually save democracy itself.
Yeah. Well, first there's fighting like hell to get on better terrain, and voting from now to November 3rd. There is then the period after that where the state vote counts will be tallied, and people can do a lot of work. California is a very blue state, but there may be controversy and attempts, as we understand it, for electors to falsify effectively the votes and bring to Congress a vote that doesn't represent the popular vote in their state. So the Electoral College is supposed to actually represent the count, right? And so there's work to be done to call places across the country, potentially, if some of those swing states are places where they're trying to stop the count, which we know the president may do. So really encouraging people to be patient, to understand we're not gonna necessarily know on election night, and that we are going to have to push to make sure that every single vote is counted. And then after the state count, it goes to Congress, and then there isn't really a referee in terms of like someone to say, okay, Donald Trump, you lost, now you have to leave. There isn't necessarily a precedent for a president who tries to stay. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can be fighting to preserve democracy, both through the actions we commit and the things we omit from doing, right? So, you know, slogans like, if democracy isn't working, I don't work, right? Or until every vote is counted, count on me to be out in the streets, or count on me to, you know, withhold my labor. So I think that that's the kind of from now to inauguration period ways of fighting for that democracy that we will miss if we don't have. And then from there, and you know, I'm not an expert in this, but I think we need to take immediate steps to address inequality and climate change. And we need to take immediate steps to undo, you know, 40 years of vote packing, right? And packing the courts, sorry, is what I meant to say. You know, John, I think it was Powell who wrote a memo in the late 70s. He was a judge about how the right wing was going to take over. And that late 70s also coincides with the rise of the prison system. It coincides with the rise of corporate power. And the way in which they have been packing the courts year after year after year has to be undone. And we have to push as progressives to change the calculus and the dynamic. So those are a few ways. I mean, you know, I'm not an expert. I think the Breathe Act is something that we should obviously be pushing for as well. And then I think the last thing that we should understand is that what we do locally matters, right? The rise of the conservative movement didn't happen with just congressional plays. They were taking over states. They were fighting at the state level. What we do here in Oakland, what we do in the Bay Area matters. Our capacity to support participatory budgeting and different forms of really bringing people into the democratic process are going to be hugely important, because I think the reality is people think of democracy like an every 4-year thing, and we need to have people think of it as an everyday thing. And what are all the ways that we can do, that we can be kind of promoting that vision?
I saw Krithika had her hand up and also had a question in the chat. Do you want to come off of mute and ask it?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And thank you, Mr. Norris, for coming to speak with us today. I think it was really nice because I feel like it's so easy with everything going on to kind of become discouraged and just caught in this state of sadness. So I really appreciated the energy you brought today. But my question was, what conditions do you think are necessary to sustain the movement for prison reform and eventually abolition that may have been missing from other movements such as SNCC?
Whew, that's a good question. I think one of the first things to acknowledge is that the government used repression very intentionally and very violently to impact Black freedom movements, what we now call the civil rights movement. And I think that there was an exploitation of difference within the movement, cleavages along the lines of patriarchy that were exploited. And so I see, you know, folks trying to develop their muscle of empathy and accountability, and challenging patriarchy within movements, and challenging heteropatriarchy, and challenging a lot of the divisions that have been stumbling blocks for past movements. So that is a good thing. That being said, I think we're getting it as it relates to differences based on identity, but I don't know that we're always getting it as it relates to differences based on ideology and politics. And so, you know, I'm thinking about this pro-democracy movement we need to build, where we are going to, some of those same folks that I like poo-pooed and said, you know, they don't understand and blah, 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 those are the folks we're going to need to work with, y'all. So let me be clear that I sort of consider myself in a space among friends and colleagues, and so I can be honest. And I will be honest even in dealings with them, but I think we have to still try to find common ground. And that means, like, I think about going to Harvard as an undergrad. There's a lot of folks I graduated with who I don't share a lot of political ideology with, but I think all of them that I know of still want democracy. They still want some semblance of democracy. They want to see transitions of power. And so I have been reaching out to those folks like, hey, alumni that I haven't talked to in a long time, like, how are you thinking about this? Are you thinking about taking a day off at your law firm or at your tech company? And like, and so I would offer that in order to be successful, we have to be more empathetic around issues of identity, but we also have to get more sophisticated around how we deal with political difference and understand that we're going to need to be better at it if we're going to be successful, and to build a broad enough tent to really marginalize the upsurge in white supremacy and fascism in this country.
Thanks. It looks like Sam had his hand up and had a question in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And thank you so much, Mr. Norris. It's been a really amazing lecture, really inspiring and also positive, and not just anxiety inducing, as you sort of mentioned earlier. I had a question about just from general experience, when people use terms like, whether it be abolition of incarceration, example being like defund the police, get rid of the punishment-based system, some people tend to instinctively just feel afraid, like, oh no, like, you're getting rid of things that I think make me safe.
Yeah.
So what is your tactic of speaking to those people who just instinctively feel like you're threatening their safety when you say things like that?
Yeah. I think that people first, there's some level of education so that folks can kind of walk in other people's shoes and understand how policing and prisons have impacted communities of color and poor people. I think there is also some level of education around how those same systems impact white folks, right? So I think you're like 4 or 5 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police in the United States as a white person than you are in Europe and other, similarly situated countries. And so that is not an easy question, right? I think about the question that Joe Biden got at the debate where Trump was like goading him to say, hey, say you're for law and order. You won't even say you're for law and order, right? And part of what was at play, and I had a disagreement with another professor at Berkeley, Ian Haney Lopez, around this, but I think he was right and I was right. And so I said, I wish Joe Biden would have said, well, the reason why I'm not going to say I'm for law and order per se, because communities of color, many folks, when they hear law and order, they think of white supremacy. They think of a long history of racial injustice. They understand the origins of policing. And I wanted him to kind of give like a background on, hey, this is why, law and order may not be what you are thinking about it as white America. And Ian was like, yeah, but no, because, law and order means something, and, maybe the presidential debate isn't the opportunity to shift consciousness around that. And so this is one of the things that I think can be hard as organizers, right? Sometimes we're put in places tactically where we see a victory in front of us, and we may have to take shortcuts to get to that victory. And the question becomes, is the shortcut worth it? And it's not an easy question to answer. And so your question isn't an easy question to answer. It's based on time, place, and conditions, right? And so the conversations that we have to be relevant to the type of conversation, right? So if you're organizing and you're in a community and you're doing that long-term work and you're able to do political education, then yes, right? But if you're out on the doors and you're knocking and you're like, hey, I need you to vote for this person, because we're effectively fighting for a different terrain, I'm not expecting you to have that long, kind of long range conversation. I had another thought about that, but maybe it'll come back to me. But that's kind of my general take, is having some grace for the fact that people are responding to that question in different ways and are, as you said, understanding what law and order means. Yeah, and my other thought comes back, I'll let you know.
Thanks. Opioma, looks like you also had a question in chat. Do you want to raise it?
Could you ask it for me? It's really kind of loud in here.
Sure. Obioma writes, what connections can we make with the allegations of the GOP fake ballots and voter suppression, and to anxiety and the criminal court reform, the false representation of popular votes? Do you want to say more, Obioma? We don't mind. Okay. It sounds like what you're saying is that there's an attempt to criminalize voters who might vote for Joe Biden. Is that essentially?
Yeah, there's so many different kinds of voter suppression happening in this moment. There's, California and the fake boxes that the GOP set up. And there's, the overt threat of violence as people of color, as Black folks and brown folks go to try to vote, right? And that has a long history in this country. So in terms of making connections, some of the connections are historic in terms of like the rise of the punishment system and prisons as we know it partly come as a result of trying to exclude Black folks from the franchise. So Black codes were laws that said that if you were found without work, if you didn't have a work pass, or they could basically lease you out to a plantation. And so that convict leasing system has been described as worse than slavery. And that history those laws from that period are the same laws that were being challenged in Florida in terms of challenging the exclusion of formerly incarcerated folks from the vote. On a broader level, I think the idea that people can be seen as undeserving of rehabilitation, as undeserving of a second chance, is intimately tied to then the ability to exclude them from the franchise and the democratic process, right? And so to me, like the notion of how we get to safety is intimately tied to our notions and understanding of democracy. In terms of how we can challenge those dynamics, I think I see people already challenging those dynamics. I see people showing up in huge numbers to vote in Georgia and Texas already. And I think, there's truth to that safety in numbers ideology. Yeah, so those are some of the ways I see people really showing up to challenge voter suppression.
So I'm not seeing other hands or questions, but I just want to follow up because there was a lot of comments in various kinds of comments in the chat about the, like, how does essentially restorative justice really work? Is it a real thing? Is it really possible to move away from the current system to something like that? So I wonder, Zach, if you could, you talked about it kind of in an esoteric way. Could you give examples of where it's actually happened, where people have actually gone through that system rather than going through the criminal justice system as it exists?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a name of a few places. Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco, New York, places across the country are using restorative justice processes. And in Alameda County, the district attorney is actually referring people to restorative justice processes. So rather than a person going through the criminal court system, basically they refer it to a nonprofit organization that then creates a voluntary process. So both the person who's been harmed and the person who's caused harm have to agree to participate in that process. But the numbers really speak for themselves in terms of lower recidivism rates, higher victim satisfaction rates. And it works not just in, less serious cases, but in really serious ones. So in San Francisco, the district attorney is referring cases for restorative justice that are more serious than Alameda County's cases. And there was a study done by Impact Justice that showed that recidivism rates were actually even lower and victim satisfaction rates even higher in more serious cases. And the theory is that in those more serious cases, the harm is more self-evident. It isn't confusing about what the harm was, and so the accountability process is that much more clear. And so, we're talking about folks who have assaulted folks. We're talking about folks who have seriously injured folks. In the Common Justice Program in Brooklyn, New York, and in other parts of New York, they're expanding. They are really challenging this dichotomy between victim and offender, right? And really showing that oftentimes the same people who have been hurt are then hurting others, right? And in order to interrupt that cycle of harm, restorative justice is a key vehicle. And so they're working with young men, often young men of color, who have been impacted by violence, and interrupting that cycle through restorative justice processes. The real question isn't like whether it works, it's a question of whether or not we will fund it. So the program I mentioned in Richmond, California, they get, I think, like $1 million a year, and the city policing gets like $60 million a year. So you talk to Devon Bogan, he's been talking to the Obama administration, everybody he can about really scaling up this violence prevention program, which is separate from restorative justice, but indicative of the kinds of programs that actually work and are still seen as kind of boutique and fringe rather than the mainstay of what we need to move forward. And that connects me to the last question. And I want to say this. I think when we're talking about moving away from policing in prisons, an analogy can be helpful. And that analogy is that we have understood that we need to divest from fossil fuels, right? 99% of scientists agree, like fossil fuels are bad. We're going to move to, renewable energy. And when things first started, like solar panels were like, what is that? Or wind turbines, right? But over time, those things start to get scaled and they start to become part of the popular consciousness. And similarly, what we were trying to do with Restore Oakland was kind of put forward our first solar panel. And, that sounds cheesy and it's historically inaccurate because restorative justice goes back eons. But at the same time, sometimes you have to like help people visibilize and see a different future. And so with Restore Oakland, we're trying to say, hey, just as we needed to move away from this dead and dying energy infrastructure, so too we need to move forward towards a life-affirming, care-centered vision of what community safety looks like. And I'm hopeful that we can start to build up and scale up some of those interventions across the country.
All right, Professor Cohen, do you want to call on? I see Eric and Rithika have their hands up. Do you want to start with Eric?
Eric, go ahead. Please ask your question.
Thank you. Hi, first of all, thank you for being here, Mr. Norris. I appreciate everything you had said thus far. And I was just curious because earlier, I know you mentioned that a couple years ago, the idea of closing down the youth prisons seemed radical to many. And now there's people who are pushing for the incarceration to cease. And I was just curious if that fits in with your personal overall goal or one of your main goals in the work you do now that you spoke of. And if so, or if not, how does that compare to the overall goal of others who work alongside you?
Yeah. I work with folks who are diehard abolitionists, and I work with folks who would regard themselves as criminal justice reformers. And I believe that we do need to divest from policing and prisons as kind of the first option as it relates to community safety. The book I wrote, We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities, describes, one scenario in which I was like, I don't know, this person had killed both of his parents. His sister was fearful for her life. And I tried to put myself in her shoes and think about if one of my siblings killed my parents, and then I felt at risk for my life as a result. And I thought about just how much I would not know my sibling, because I've known them all my life, and then they were to do something like that. That's not exactly how that scenario happened. There was a series of traumas and tortures that this person, James, went through that really impacted his mental health stability. His family tried to get support time and time again. His sister tried to reach out to the sheriff's office to let them know that she was fearful for her parents' life. And so in some ways that story is a story about the failure of the criminal court system to actually keep us safe. And at the same time, if I'm honest, I don't necessarily know what it looks like to, at this moment, think about a different outcome for James. And I describe in the book all of the different points up into that tragic incident where there was a whole host of different interventions that could have happened that had nothing to do with the criminal court system, from school to employment to actually getting him mental health support. So I would regard myself as someone who is really pushing for a world without policing and prisons, and believe that we need to fundamentally remake public safety in this country. And I'm also, admittedly, like, what do we do with Donald Trump? He is someone, and I say that with some sincerity, like, here's a person who has committed all kinds of harms, and who has all kinds of power. And in the process of transitioning to democracy, where he to try to maintain power and to try to continue to build a kind of white supremacist movement, I think we have to really grapple with hard questions around what's the transition process. And I think abolitionists will tell you that it's not an on-off switch. So Alex Vitale, who wrote The End of Policing, will tell you it's not an on-off switch. You don't go from like having police as sort of the dominant framework and intervention points to just then not having them at all. But you can think about, like, who are the first responders? How do we begin to move to a different paradigm? And what are the structures, much in the same way, and that's why I use the sort of climate as an example, that we can think about moving away from a dependence on fossil fuels to a different energy infrastructure. And I think similarly, we can do that in the context of community safety.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate the questions around abolition. They're certainly pressing, and how to talk about them and how to think about them. I would just, I won't want to get to student questions, but just on that note, I offer, this, I'm sure you're familiar with this text, which is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book, yes. Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California. And it's a history of the California prison system. And Ruthie really is one of the most prominent prison abolitionists in the country. And she was former geography professor here at UC Berkeley. She's in New York now. But in her book, she offers a definition of racism that, Zachary, I would ask if you get your comments on, because I think it fits to the abolitionist horizon, where she describes racism as, quote, racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So it's worth repeating here. Racism specifically is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And by this, right, it is about that people of color live in unsafe communities. They live in toxic communities. They're subjected to substandard medical care. They are given the worst voting conditions. And for that, it offers this sort of explanation that abolition, right, as you say, is not an on-off switch. It is a horizon. It is a way of approaching and seeking to mitigate and transform these state-sanctioned exploitation of group differentiated exposure to premature death.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, you know, if you could talk about, like, in a sense, like how abolition, you imagine abolition, what prospects you think that particular movement has in this moment, and how it addresses this larger question of racism.
Yeah, I think that when we understand abolition in that broader context, it really, for me, boils down to, you know, revolutionary change inside of our country. It boils down to the need for transformative change, and in all the ways, right? So looking at that map that I showed of redlining and substandard housing that you mentioned, and finding ways to actually right those harms, right? And that is what we call a truth and reinvestment process. And it's kind of a play on truth and reconciliation. It's a long way of saying reparations, but I think undoing racism, as Professor Wilson Gilmore defines it, is about really shifting those dynamics and righting those harms. I lost my train of thought, so come back to me on that. I'll circle back to that question.
No worries at all. Let's go to Allison and ask her to unmute and ask her a question.
Hi. Thank you again so much for coming and speaking. You had really great things to say. My question for you is kind of more just about like wording, I guess. You talked a lot about like restorative justice, and I remember in a social justice class I took at my CAC, my professor was very distinctional between restorative and transformative justice, and how one kind of restorative being kind of restores to the situation before the crime occurred and is focused on the perpetuator of the crime and the victim of the crime, whereas transformative justice kind of takes into like the larger social aspects of what might have caused that crime to occur. And I just wanted to know like what your take is on the difference between the two, and if the work that you're doing actually is transformative, it's just a difference of words being used. But yeah. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate that question. Yeah, a lot of people say, you know, restorative justice, well, you're restoring things back to the unequal state that they were before. You know, I take a longer term idea of restorative in that sense. And like, I'm thinking about restoring relationship. I'm thinking about restoring, as Indigenous folks, a kind of balance or a respect, you know, for balance and a balance that has been broken, a harm that has been caused, and bringing folks back into relationship. You know, I think there are elements of what we're trying to do at Restore Oakland that I do think are transformative, in the sense that, you know, we are doing the restorative justice process, but we're also trying to connect people with economic opportunity, right? So, you know, someone may have an aha moment like, hey, I caused this harm. This person is now up at night. They can't sleep. I feel bad about that. But I find myself in the same, you know, economic situation that led me to snatch that purse or to cause that person harm and take what they had. And so I think in a certain sense, you know, we are pushing for transformative justice to not just sort of restore what was before, but also to look at the conditions that drove that harm in the first place. One thing I will say is that I think we abandon terms too fast on the left, and I think we give up ground on words too fast. And by that, I mean, like, there is a tendency for people to co-opt the language and the words that we use. And so there's been this movement to kind of reimagine public safety, right? And some folks are reimagining public safety in the context of policing in ways that don't feel like really a real reimagination. It feels like sort of restoring trust to an entity that has been positively harmful and untrustworthy since the beginning of the country. And so I get why people are wary of co-optation of the words that we use. At the same time, like, I think we have to fight for a bigger we, and we have to fight for the terms to mean what people think they should mean, almost, right? And maybe that's partly where Ian Haney Lopez was coming from and saying, no, we should say like law and order, but also point out that Donald Trump has been breaking the law time and time and time again. In another context, I was saying, you know, I think we need to move towards a public health vision of community safety rather than a punitive one. And folks were like, well, public health is fraught with peril. You know, it is a history of the Tuskegee experiments on folks. It is a history of sterilization of women of color. And yet at its face, like, public health sounds like public health, y'all. I'm like, so I think it's a semantic question, but it's also in my mind a question of how much space we try to occupy. And are we trying to lead the whole, or are we trying to lead our little narrow space where we feel comfortable and we feel like the words that we're using are right on and feel the most righteous? And I'm not saying that I'm not trying to say that in a disparaging way, but I am trying to say it as a sort of call to arms. Like, let's fight for a drastically different world, but let's also like occupy the space we need to win that world. And from my perspective, we need to occupy the space of like, we're the normal. We are going to really define these terms. We are not going to allow that co-optation. And I know that's complicated, but that's a little bit of my rambling on that question.
Solid. Ritika, I think this is our last hand up, but we'll see where we are for time. But Ritika, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Norris. I agree with what all the other students have said before me. This has been a fantastic presentation. I have a quick question just about the resources required to establish systems of restorative justice and how those compare to what is required to build this prison system that's growing and growing and growing. Yeah, what is required to establish, just like you and Professor Jayaraman did, to establish a restorative justice system?
Well, restorative justice in comparison to the cost of incarceration is actually really cheap from a monetary perspective. It's much less expensive to do a restorative justice process than it is to incarcerate somebody by on the order of magnitude of 10 or more. But that can be deceptive, because I don't think we, by and large, want to frame these issues around economics and things being cheaper, because it ends up like reinforcing kind of a dynamic that we want to avoid, which is the value of people and the value being sort of almost monetized. And I'm not appropriately capturing all of the sort of pitfalls in that, but I will say that the cost of it is also the challenge of really shifting people's perspective and moving away from seeing folks as less than or incapable of redemption and rehabilitation. And that is the bigger challenge, really, than the challenge around resources, because as we've seen, as I hope I kind of illustrated with some of the statistics, like, it's not a shortage of resources that is preventing us from doing the right thing. It really is a system that knows what it's up to. And as as Professor Cohen was saying, and as is described in Golden Gulag, like, there was an intentional redirection of resources and the state surplus towards punishment. as a primary vehicle for ensuring social control and leveraging the resources of the state towards that end. So it's really about developing the political will to take care of people, all people, rather than not. And I think that's the bigger challenge. The reality is most of the interventions that we're calling for are much less expensive than locking people up.
I'm not seeing any hands. I'm going to ask you some closing questions, Zach. Can you
Sure.
talk a little, I mean, you've been involved with the movement for Black Lives really since the beginning. I think students would love to hear, if you don't mind sharing what happened on the Bay Bridge a few years ago, that would be great if you could share that experience. And then kind of how you've seen the movement evolve, and particularly this year, you know, what hope do you have for the movement going forward?
Yeah, thanks for that question. As you know, the Black Lives Matter movement for Black Lives was really building. There were folks across the country who were taking action, and I was able to take action in a couple of different protests. One to stop the BART trains from running on Black Friday. I think that was November of 2014 or 2015. And then afterwards, with a collective called Black Seed, to stop the traffic on the Bay Bridge. And, you know, it was a powerful action. It was a demonstration of really trying to push for no more business as usual. And I think that we are going to have to continue to push in that direction. This history doesn't have a practice of respecting Black lives. This country doesn't have a practice of respecting Black and Indigenous lives, and that's a real understatement. And so if we are going to move away from a status quo that devalues the lives of Black and brown people and poor people in this country, we are going to have to take risks. So that's the sort of paradoxical thing about safety in this moment, is that in order to get to safety, we are going to have to take risks. But the good news is that, you know, the risks don't have to always look the same. That isn't always about, you know, doing a big civil disobedience. It can be about staying home and refusing to work. It can be about a whole host of different ways to contribute. And I hope that each and every one of you will be thinking about what can you offer, and what is your contribution here and now, because we desperately need you. Like, there is a moment that will impact the future of this country and the future of the world. And all of us are going to have to think through, like, what can we do? And the thing that I would close on is just, you know, is to say, like, you don't have to be the most courageous. You don't have to be, you know, the most out there. It's about finding people who can support you in doing the right thing. It's about being around folks who understand your vision of what's possible and who will support you in moving it forward. So appreciate all of y'all for taking the time to listen to me. And want to thank Professor Jayaraman and Professor Cohen for the opportunity as well.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thanks for taking time today. Really appreciate it.
Right on. Y'all be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.